Hello everyone. So in this video, we're going to talk about how an artist would look at a website. You can look at websites using Gestalt theory, talk about all the psychology of perception, but the reality is art has been studying composition much longer, for hundreds of years. We've talked about what makes something feel balanced, what makes it feel very dissonant. And a lot of those principles, it turns out, apply to our websites when we are designing them. So we're going to look at just a few of those techniques that artists would use to evaluate composition and see how we can use them to inform our design when we're making decisions. So just as with the Gestalt rules, this is a very big topic. There are entire art classes just studying these rules. So this is not an exhaustive list at all. I am going to focus on 3 rules in particular: axes of symmetry, rhythm, and proportion, and use that as sort of a jumping off point for your own explorations in this topic. So to get us started, let's talk about the axes of symmetry. So when we're designing websites, we have to be very careful about the lines that we're creating intentionally and unintentionally. So in our context, what I mean by an axis of symmetry is any physical or implied line that divides your content into 2 parts. So we can create this with a literal hard line, a border around a block element, or some other physical barrier in our design, but often these things get created purely by the negative space when we have a feed of elements that happen to line up. So as an example of this, let's look at the Twitter layout. On the Twitter layout, you've got profile images coming down this vertical line on the left, and then post bodies coming down on the right. And right between those 2 columns of elements, we've got this little gutter of white space here. So we've already talked about how this helps people group the profile images as separate from the content. But in terms of composition, what we are doing here is creating an axis of symmetry, a vertical axis that kind of begs for something to be on the left side and the right side of it. These profile images are, in terms of the composition, almost being given equal importance to the post body. So they adjust and account for that fact by making the profile image take up much less space, which creates a sort of sense of dissonance. It draws you back to focusing on the post bodies. And this is a lot of the way that axes are used in composition, is to kind of force your mind to divide things up. And an important thing to note is that the thing you're putting on the left and the right naturally does, like there is this imposition on your design to put something on both sides here, and you have to be careful what it is that you are kind of equating on either side of your axis of alignment here. These appear both vertically and horizontally, and one of the neat ways that you can use an axis like this is to kind of tell users how they should be progressing through your web page. So in this case, we've got this very strong vertical axis here that divides up the main content area, and that creates a lot of downward force for someone scrolling the web site. Just intuitively, if you're reading something, there's a strong inclination to go left to right. When we read a book, you go line by line, top to bottom. What that means is a lot of the force in a website naturally is to go horizontally. By creating one of these strong vertical lines somewhere in your main content area, you're kind of redirecting a lot of that energy, encouraging people to scroll in deeper. If that's not as much a priority, then you might reach for something like a horizontal line. So a great example of this is something like an image carousel. On an image carousel, you've got the center of your image and there's these two little buttons generally on either side. And that line of images on the carousel plus the little buttons on the side, that creates a very strong horizontal axis of symmetry. We've got equal parts of the image above and below. Normally there's a header way up above that and a banner. Normally below that is the main content of a page. Again, we're dividing up two different areas of our website, the above the fold portion and below the fold portion in that case. But that encourages users to actually spend more time up top because there's this horizontal axis. They feel compelled to click through the carousel, look at the thing, spend a little bit more time on that top part of your design. And so you should always be thinking, as you are designing your websites, what are places that I could be creating these lines, either purposefully to guide my users to a particular part of my page, or unintentionally in a way that might get users trapped on a part of the page I don't want them focusing on. And the next topic I want to talk about is actually closely related to this. It's the idea of rhythm. So naturally, our eyes look for patterns. It's sort of what we do. That was actually a huge part of Gestalt theory. Even artistically, through the use of patterns, we can structure our web pages in a way that allows our users to much more easily interpret the hierarchy we're trying to communicate to them. So as an example, let us take a look at this Zillow listing page here. So I scrolled to a random spot on the map, clicked, and I got this giant sidebar here. And there is a lot of information in this sidebar. We've got little like buttons and user controls. We've got these special offer banners up in the corner. There are large images for each listing that I believe actually rotate through. And then we've got the details of the listing below, the price, and then the details like square footage, how many beds, how many baths. That's a lot of information. And if we're not very conscious about how we are presenting this information, it could be very overwhelming for users. It could be easy to get lost and not know which thing applies to which listing. Oh, is this the bed and bath for above or is it for below? So Zillow makes very effective use of rhythm to help establish a cadence to how they're presenting this to people. On every single one of these listings, the majority of the space is taken up by the image, the actual showcase photos of whatever apartment they're renting out. Up in the corners, we've got these little flavor elements, the little special offer, how many are available, whatever goes in that blue banner, and the little like button. Down below, the thing taking up the greatest amount of space in that bottom text box is the price, because that is what most people are filtering on, and then the details come below that. And there's a very, very rigid pattern to this. If I were just scrolling up and down this page, I could stop anywhere. And because there is this strong repetition, I would immediately know, okay, well, here are the beginnings of one line of listing, the end of the listings above it. There's a pattern that makes it much more efficient for me to process this information. So one way that rhythm is often used is when we have serial content. This is something like a social media website with dozens of posts. This is something like our listings here. Whenever you've got content that is sort of a directory like this, one common browsing pattern your users have is to sort of skim through to find the ones that they're interested in. By establishing a rhythm, we make it easier for our users to filter and only look at the fields that they're interested in. In this case, I might just be looking at the photos. And so this rhythm emphasizes the ability to do that by making the photos take up a lot of space, kind of be the cornerstone that all of the rest of the listing is funneled around. I scroll down until I see a photo that just catches my eye and I need to know more. Then I can drill in deep and look at all of the information around it. The rhythm makes it easy for me to just look at that part. Or if I'm just looking at prices, I can be scrolling down until I see something that isn't $2,500. And as soon as I see that one in the front, then I actually look at the photo and say, does this look like a place I could live? That is a really effective way to use rhythm, is to kind of enable this type of behavior. One other comment I do want to make about rhythm is that it kind of goes hand in hand with axes of symmetry. It can actually be helpful to think about both of these topics together as you are designing your website. If we go back and look at that Twitter layout page, along that vertical axis, we're slotting in post after post after post, and the posts themselves then naturally fall into a rhythm. Each one has the username, we've got the profile image over on the left, we've got the post body, and then all of these interaction buttons at the bottom, reply and retweet and like and share. This creates a rhythm, and that is fairly typical when you have a axis of alignment. The elements that are on that axis, not always, but very often, will have some rhythm or should have some rhythm established to them. If we're on a news website, it might be articles that have titles and little flavor images on the left. If we're on social media, it might be posts and their authors. If we're on a listing website, it might be all the details like we just saw on Zillow. But generally, when you have an axis, you should be thinking about the rhythm that someone is experiencing as they're moving down along that axis. Doing that can make it much easier to create websites with a strong hierarchy where users have a better idea how to engage with content on any particular part of the page. So the last topic I want to look at in the rules of composition is proportion. So proportion is one of the biggest topics in artistic composition, and figuring out how to proportion our available space is a pretty big deal. It is a lot of what makes art art. In the same thing, it is one of the hardest decisions we have as a web designer, figuring out, well, how do I divide up how much room there should be for the main content area, how much there should be for the sidebar, how much up top for the banner. And so it helps to have some guidelines that give us just good rules of thumb. In traditional art, there are a lot of options available to us. And generally, the way that we study this is through the use of decomposition. We take some photograph that has a lot of details and we sketch out, well, just what are the shapes that I see here? Decompose those real things into collages of a bunch of shapes mapped together. And then zoom out one more layer. Take those shapes and now look, if you took all those shapes and made a big shape out of them, what shape would you end up with? And do that recursively again and again and again until eventually you end up with just one giant shape. The entire painting was actually a triangle all along. On the web, we're kind of limited in the shapes we have to work with. You're not going to see something like a triangular composition on most websites because all of our content generally wants to be rectangular. Blocks of text, big paragraphs, generally are flush on one side, roughly flush on the other. We've got that first line, the last line. Generally, it's going to want to be rectangular. Most photos, we can put them in circular bubbles, but there's always this kind of blockish, squarish space that they're taking up. Same thing with videos. And so while we can't use all of the rules of composition, the intuitions that we can derive from that still apply. So one trick that artists like to use is to think about space recursively. Take the space of the entire piece, find some line, some axis of symmetry maybe that already exists, and look at the proportion of space that's taken up. If you rotate that and then stick it in the bigger of the items, you can often then find another axis that lines up right there. Kind of thinking about this in reverse, one way that we could do this is say, I've got some element on my web page. That element, I'm going to duplicate it, stick it on itself, take that entire new thing that's created, duplicate it, stick it on itself. We can build out or in, and what we end up with there is a tiled design that follows a particular mathematical property, what is called the golden ratio. So the golden ratio is literally exactly what we just described doing. It is any ratio, so any separation of space into two parts, where the difference between those two parts is the same as the difference between the larger of those two parts and the total space that they take up together. So to sort of explain this, if we look at this red block here and the entire rest of everything together, there's this line about 2/3 to the right, a little bit less. If I take this entire shape and I rotate it on its side, say, okay, now this red block is the orange block, and all of this is now all of that stuff on the bottom. That line here is again about 2/3 down. It's no longer across, it's now down. But same thing, if I take that entire shape again, shrink it down once more, and now the big one is the yellow and the green and all the rest is the other side again, it's about 2/3 over now to the left in the opposite direction because it's upside down. But this proportion stays constant at every level of recursion. We're breaking up our space along a similar pattern. And the really, really neat thing about this is we don't need to work with perfect squares. This works no matter what shape we do it with. If I say, well, here's my entire browser window, I'm assuming I've got about 1,000 pixels across. So my main content area, my entire web page is going to be 1,000 pixels, and then there'll just be margin auto on either side. If I want to figure out, well, how much of that 1,000 should be my sidebar, I can take this shape, rotate it on its side, and then make it so the width is now the height. So I shrink down 1,000 to 618. And that means I now have a rectangle that's 382 by 618. The 1,000 is to the 618 as the 618 is to the 382. The kind of proportion, the aspect ratio of this rectangle here is the same as the original rectangle for my entire monitor of my prototypical monitor. I can then divide it up again, do the same thing, take that same aspect ratio again and say, okay, well, you know what? I have an area down here or an area up top, whichever one. And again, try to make it so that now going across fits inside this 382, and then I figure out, well, what would the smaller dimension be? And continue tiling it and tiling it and tiling it. And what I end up with is a lot of differently shaped blocks of space that are in particular areas on the screen. And your first thought might be, well, what do I do with this? I'm not actually going to put anything in this tiny little box right here. Like, I have no use for that. That's now wasted space. What am I doing? And the answer is that the way that we use these blocks is not always as hard lines of content. I'm not expecting you to put a div in a div in a div in a div. Instead, in the structure of the website that we've already got, we try to look for axes of alignment that exist or create axes along one of these lines, one of these division points, somewhere in this spiral, even if it is for content that's already in a block that exists somewhere else. So to see an example of how this might look on a real website, I'm going to pull up Twitter again. So if we look at Twitter here, Twitter has a main content area and a sidebar. So if we look at that main content area and that sidebar, what we find is exactly that pattern that we just saw above. The main content area takes up most of the space, and then the sidebar takes up the amount that would be left if we sort of rotated the entire thing on its side. We go one level deeper and we've got this first line here. So there was our first division between our sidebar and content area. Very strong vertical line, actually a hard line from the difference in background colors here. The next line, it looks like we're cutting right through something, so it's already violated. Looks like, oh, well, maybe this was all made up. But if we're very, very careful and look, what we've got here is there's a banner up top, and then there's all of the content below. And to divide the banner up top and the content below, there are a bunch of little tabs that are available right on the border. The very first bit of content is these tabs. Each tab has a title and a big number below it. The title and the big number below it are actually creating a gutter, a implied line that creates a horizontal axis of symmetry. If we draw a line from this horizontal axis of symmetry and extend it across, turns out it lines up exactly with this first point of recursion in our golden ratio. The proportion of space for the banner in the main content area is actually divided vertically along this same ratio as the division between our sidebar and our main content area. And as we go deeper, like that is right there, we've got our primary vertical division, we've got our primary horizontal division. Things are going to become less pronounced from there. But if we look at the next division, we've got this next line here. Now you're going to say, there's no way you're going to find anything for that. That line goes straight through the center of the sidebar. But if we look carefully, the sidebar, if we look at the end of the title and the end of the following notice, that pretty much exactly lines up with this block. So now we've got blank space on the right and actual title text, some content on the left. There's a perfect division there. And further down at the bottom of the sidebar, they decided to put two buttons side by side. I think it's like a follow button and a direct message button. If we look at the follow button and the direct message button, there is some space between them. And where does that space line up? Again, right on this ratio. We've now divided, well, here's the left button and the right button. So as we recurse deeper and deeper, the divisions aren't quite as pronounced. Like this first main content and sidebar division, there's different background colors. That's really obvious. The first horizontal division between the banner image and the content area, again, really, really strong. And as we go deeper, this line still has use. It still gets used to figure out, well, if I have stuff that only has to be half as long, let me line it up so that the end of it or the start of it is flush with one of my axes. Or again, if we rotate in again, notice where eye level is always detected for your profile photo, eye level lines up with that next line. We can keep finding something to put at each level of this ratio. And what this does is it creates a very harmonious, very balanced looking web page. If you've noticed, every single social media website ever, LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook, all eventually end up converging on sort of this same design here. And the reason why is because they're all making use of the golden ratio to figure out how to proportion their space. They've all got basically the same content at the end of the day. So if we employ those principles of artistic design, we can sort of derive a prototypical social media website design that we could use for any website we ever want to create that has that type of serial content. So that's just one way that we can use the rules of composition to inform our design. In this video, we looked at axes of symmetry, which are times that we create a strong vertical or horizontal line that splits content into two parts, how this lets us sort of guide users and shows them the direction that they should be navigating, the things they should be paying attention to, how we can purposefully unbalance this by making a side larger or smaller. And from there, we talked about rhythm, the establishment of a pattern, so that what would be overwhelming amounts of information becomes much more structured, easy to efficiently skim through along one of the axes that we've already created for our users. And then we've looked at proportion, how we can use the golden ratio to figure out exactly how much space we should be taking up for different elements on our web page. As I said at the start of this video, this barely scratches the surface, but I hope this gives you a good jumping off point to be thinking about how art can actually inform the design of web pages. In the next video, we're going to look at another artistic set of rules for the use of color. So look forward to that, and I will catch you all in the next video.